morning. Good morning and welcome to this year's Andrew Burgess Lecture in Global Mission. The Burgess Lectures are jointly sponsored by Luther Seminary and the Global Mission Institute. This was made possible by a fund established in 1991 in honor of Andrew Burgess, former missionary, missionary executive, and professor of missions here at Luther Seminary. He was active for a very long time, from the 1920s to the 1980s. At the invitation of the Commission on World Missions of the Lutheran World Federation, Burgess founded the Institute for Churchmen from Asia and Africa in 1956. This was instrumental for establishing many of the international relations which today are so important for our school. Over the last 50 years, nearly 400 students from 66 countries have studied at Luther Seminary. After their studies, many of them became important church leaders in their home countries, others influential teachers. We are glad that we could help publishing some of the PhD theses of our international students. Among them are Checkmark Niraj Ekas, Christ as Sacrament and Example, Lutheran Theology of the Cross and its Relevance for South Asia, and Thomas Oduro's Christ Holy Church International, the story of an African independent church. The series Encounters in World Christianity is funded by the Justice and Christian Community Program and the Global Mission Institute. The books will be on display outside. The Burgess Lecture was inaugurated in 1991. Kenneth Craig, a renowned scholar of Islam and Christian-Muslim relations, gave the first lecture. Since then, leading scholars in global mission come to Luther Seminary usually at the beginning of October. The Burgess Lecture opens the series of public lectures of the academic year. The aim of these lectures is to interpret the task of global mission today in the light of the Christian tradition, the historical experience of the Church, and the contemporary situation in the world. We are grateful indeed that Professor Wanda Deifelt, a well-known international theologian originally from Brazil, accepted our invitation. She will now be introduced by Professor Gary Simpson.
Good morning, friends in Christ. It is my privilege today to introduce to you Professor Wanda Deifelt. Professor Wanda Deifelt is from Brazil, where she received her bachelor's degree at Escola Superior de Teologia. She'll know that not only does my Spanish not exist, but my Portuguese is even worse. She was a pastor in Brazil during the early 90s, and also then taught at her own alma mater from 91 to 2004. She has a PhD from Garrett Theological Seminary and Northwestern University in Chicago in Evanston, Illinois. And she currently is the Associate Professor of Christian Theology in the Department of Religion and Philosophy at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, where I'm supposed to bring you greetings from my daughter Elena, who just graduated from there last year, and who I know Wanda has met with her on numerous occasions and nurtured her in her Spanish and in her international public health vocation. That's the kind of person she is. She went out of her way to look Elena up and to take time for that. Wanda serves on a number of professional organizations around the world. She's globally known, one of the most important Lutheran theologians around the globe. She's been on the board of the Institute for Ecumenical Studies in Strasbourg, France. She's been a theological advisor to the Council of the Lutheran World Federation, the Standing Committee on Ecumenical Affairs in Geneva. She's been on the board of the Ecumenical Institute at Bosse of the World Council of Churches. Actually, we've gotten to know each other a little bit over the last couple of years because we've been on the agenda together. A few years ago, my daughter Elena asked, "So, Dad, what kinds of things are you working on these days?" And I said, "Well, I've been doing a lot of work on sex and violence." And she says, "Those are kind of old subjects, aren't they, Dad?" But those are exactly the two subjects that Wanda and I shared the podium on in the last few years. I'm going to read a few of the things that she's done, but you'll see the breadth of the work that she's been doing over these last years. She serves on a number of scholarly activities, including editing of journals and working on a number of projects. Among these she has 54 chapters in books that other people have edited. And it tells you some of the depth and the breadth around the world. I'll read just a few of the subject matters for you. A Lutheran Ethics of Embodied Care. Feminist Theology, a Key for Women's Citizenship in the Church. Communion and Reconciliation. The Relevance of the Doctrine of Justification. Metanoia. Power, Authority, and the Bible. For God is also the God of bodies, embodiment and sexuality in Martin Luther's theology. And then a recent one that will come out in a volume from the Lutheran World Federation in the next few weeks, Lutheran Notes on the Fundamental Problem with Fundamentalism. Vulnerability and Security, a Paradox based on the theology of incarnation. Global Theology and its Implications for the North Atlantic World. I could read off tens of more, but you get an idea of the breadth of her work. She comes to us today, and she'll be speaking about the quotidian and the mission of the church, saving souls, feeding bodies, healing lives. I give you Professor Wanda Deifelt, a careful and catalytic theologian. Thanks for being with us today.
Good morning, everybody. After an introduction like this, I feel like we just go home and call it a day. Thank you. I would like to extend my appreciation and thankfulness for the invitation to be here this morning, and for everybody who has been working so hard to organize this event. I would like to say thank you not only to the faculty with whom I have had a very long and friendly type of relationship to the institution, but also above all, I would say, let's give thanks to the Triune God for bringing us here, for making this new day, and for giving us this opportunity to share our experiences and to envision together what mission can look like in the 21st century. I would like to dedicate this lecture this morning in the memory of Pastor Richard Wangen, who was an ELC missionary to Brazil, who was my professor, and who taught me much of what I know about mission today. And he died last year of cancer, and he is missed by, I would say, not only the Brazilians, but everybody around the world who has met him. The title of this conversation today is The Quotidian and the Mission of the Church, Saving Souls, Feeding Bodies, Healing Lives. One of my children's favorite games to play was treasure hunt. Clues were left, usually by my oldest daughter, in different parts of the house or the yard, and the children will look for the clues, chasing from one place to another in excited anticipation. It always struck me that the best part of the game was not to find the treasure, and the treasure was usually just a small piece of candy or a mint or something like that, but the best part of the game was the chase itself. They didn't actually like the end of the game very much because that meant, well, the excitement is over. And similar to any Pirate of the Caribbean movie or any Dan Brown novel, what made it exciting was not the end, but the thrill of the search, the process of solving the riddles. In this game in particular, what made the game exciting was the capacity of the map maker to give enough details to lead the children on, yet not to give enough information to make the search pointless. And I want to start this lecture going back to the history of cartography, the art of making and reading maps. Between the 15th and 17th century, the period of time that marks the birth of modern science, maps slowly disengaged from what they had originally been. And originally, they had been itineraries. The earliest kind of map was not really a map in the geographical sense, but was rather a history book, which recorded experiences of a journey, such as a pilgrimage, and put it in pictures and words. This drawing outlines not the route, there wasn't one, but the log of the journey on foot, an outline marked out by footprints with regular gaps between them, and by pictures of the successive events that took place in the course of the journey. A map traced the itinerary that made the journey possible, telling the story and the conditions of its possibility. Later, maps became more autonomous. Maps from the so-called time of the discovery of the Americas, for instance, reduced the signs of the journey that made the trajectory possible and did not reveal as much of the process of creation. Maps were less of a narrative than they were representations. Visible on maps during this time are still the figures of ships or of monsters, but these figurations, like fragments of stories, mark on the map the historical operations from which they resulted. Thus, the sailing ship painted on the sea in one of these maps indicates that the expedition actually took place, and it had to take place by means of a ship. Our modern maps no longer have any figures that give away the context in which the maps were developed, nor of its very first voyage. We are left with an abstraction which symbolizes the process of its original trajectory and makes the same itinerary possible for other anonymous voyagers. In the words of Michel de Certeau, the map colonizes space. It eliminates, little by little, the pictorial figurations of the practices that produce it. And the current map is a testimony to the capacity of forgetting the evidence of its own construction. Maps reveal the eradication of the practices that give origin to the map itself, the stories that they originally told. I use this lengthy introduction about the creation of maps because, in my opinion, it serves as a metaphor for a similar story, that of the Christian involvement in mission. It is comparable to the extent that when we talk about mission, as if one reads the books or theological journals that deal with mission, it is almost like looking at a contemporary map. We can read it, we can understand it, we can even navigate uncharted territory with them, yet they do not always tell the story that they gave origin to the map itself. In order to reclaim the story of mission and make visible the evidence of its own construction, we need an epistemological key, a key of knowledge, a lens that allows us to unveil what this is all about. And this epistemological key, in my opinion, is the question for the quotidian, the everyday practices, or simply life in its daily manifestations. Quotidian, by the way, is a word extremely used in the context of Latin America. We speak in Portuguese about cotidiano. In Spanish, we speak about cotidianidad. And you see that in publications, for instance, of some of the French theories called the quotidien. It is very much a part of the reflections because it comes out of the experiences of the simple people. So that is why quotidian, everydayness, needs to be reclaimed in order to unveil a new possibility of what it means to engage in mission. So the story of producing and reading maps also echoes the way theological texts are produced and read. In the study of theology and of mission, we often focus on the end result of things. We study the outcome, which comes in the form of dogmas or formulae, on the nature, for instance, and I know that some of you are students of theology. We study the nature of sacraments, the church, ordination, salvation, eschatology, rather than the journey that gave origin to these constructions. And we look at these notions and principles as we would look at maps, as abstract symbolizations that indicate a path, the highways and byways of church life, and similar to maps, and you certainly experience trying to figure out maps of large metropolitan areas like the Twin Cities, for instance, when there is road construction going on, it is easy to get lost. And if you miss the right exit ramp, it takes you forever to get on the right track. And even MapQuest doesn't help you very much. To engage in theological studies and missiological theology as if one were reading maps in their abstract version is therefore highly problematic. It gives the impression that there is only one way to get someplace and that this route is absolute. We are no longer able to see the context, the figurations or the drawings or the paintings on the margin, the original journey and the stories that were told, and we end up confusing the map with the territory itself. And in doing so, we miss the opportunity of seeing them as lived experiences, as stories about life itself, an invitation to pursue our own trajectories and to include our own spiritual paths in this ongoing work of map making. Let me exemplify this by using the famous biblical quote about mission that is found in Matthew 28:19, also known as the Great Commission. And it reads, Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. There are parallels found in the other synoptic gospels as well, of course. We are so used to reading this text that we only focus on the order to go, to move from one place to another in the name of God, and turn others into Christians. We read the text as we would read a map, without asking why this order is given and what exactly the spreading of the gospel entails. The more the interpretations are distanced from the original event, the more their abstraction becomes evident. But the order only makes sense in the wider context of Jesus' life and ministry, and not as an isolated grid on a map as I contend. One of the most problematic interpretations of the Great Commission is that the purpose of Christian mission is solely, uniquely, exclusively that of saving souls. The parallel text in Mark, that's found in the 16th chapter of the Gospel, marks the urgency of the commission and states it in the following way. The one who believes and is baptized will be saved, but the one who does not believe will be condemned. In preparing for this lecture, I revisited documents and statements, final statements, of several World Mission Conferences, and I was not surprised to find how strong and deep the dichotomy, the separation between body and soul actually runs. Of course, this misunderstanding is present since the first centuries of the Christian church. The Gnostics, for instance, had a very, very negative view of the human body, which led them to dispute the incarnation. They argued that Jesus could never have been fully human, or felt bodily desires, or even suffered. Similar views were also shared by the Docetists. They maintained that Christ only appeared to have a human body, and that he had pretended to suffer. These thoughts reflect the influence of Greek dualism, where the flesh represented a prison for the human soul and a hindrance to a devout spiritual life. According to Platonic ideals, the soul sought to be freed from the carcass of the body, finally achieving its freedom when the body died. The human body and the material world were considered inferior to the soul, and this hierarchical dualism led to two extremes in the Greco-Roman world. Option A, the body was either kept under control through ascetic practices and spiritual contemplation, or option B, the body was overly indulged to orgies and bacchanals. Needless to say, the Christians went with option A, because they were not willing to identify with orgies and bacchanals or any other practice that might be morally questionable. And the tendency was then to emphasize the ascetic contemplative mode. For many early Christians, especially church fathers, who defended asceticism, procreation or to indulge in anything that had to do with physical pleasure, the pleasure of eating a good meal, the pleasure of feeling warmth when it is cold, the pleasure of enjoying in sexual intercourse. But procreation, everything that had to do with that, perpetuated the cycle of sin and death. An idea that was not Christian, but very Platonic, but somehow it sneaked in. And to exemplify this, let me just quote from Jerome. I really like this quote because it gives you an idea of how strong their opinions were. Jerome was comparing virginity, widowhood, and marriage. And he gave a numerical value to each of these categories. He gave virginity a value of 100, widowhood 60, and marriage 30. Meaning to say virginity, widowhood, and marriage. Of course, higher up was virginity, and then widowhood, and then marriage. He said that virginity filled heaven, whereas marriage filled the earth. Therefore, for these early church fathers, it was more desirable to tend to spiritual issues than bodily ones, since they distracted a Christian from the pursuit of salvation. The quotidian, or everything that had to do with everyday life, the daily tasks of caring for bodily needs, these were all distractions from the central mission of evangelization and mission itself. If the body could perish, but the soul could survive, very soon the focus of Christianity and of Christian mission became the soul and not the body. And this is ironic considering how much the early Christian practice of diaconia, service, emphasized feeding the hungry, caring for the sick, and tending for the well-being of bodies. But this dichotomy between body and soul played nicely in the expansionist tendencies of the Roman Empire, then the Holy Roman Empire, and the many other empires that followed. As post-colonial theorists and theologians correctly point out, Christian theology was only able to function as ideological justification for conquest once those who were conquered were stripped of their dignity as human beings and compared to soulless heathens or inferior beings. These are horrifying chapters in the history of Christianity, and they should not be forgotten. The Crusades, the annihilation of indigenous people, the trafficking of slaves, and all the holy wars carried out in the name of God. One of the most moving experiences I ever had was the conference on world mission that happened in Salvador, Brazil in 1996, under the theme, Call to One Hope, the Gospel in Diverse Cultures. At the public celebration that was held outside of the conference hall, we all moved ourselves to what used to be the slave dock during colonial times. And all of the participants of the conference, in coming at this dock and being reminded of what had happened in that place for centuries, all of us had to come to terms painfully that the effects of spreading Christianity also included bring millions of human beings into slavery. The African slaves who were baptized by force on the navios negreiros, the slave ships, sailing from Ghana to Brazil, they were crushed in the name of God. The salty tears became one with the salty waters of the oceans. And through a liturgy of repentance, we voiced our sorrow for having misinterpreted the Great Commission. We also vouched never to put human interests ahead of God's word of love and mercy and justice. This was very different from an earlier conference on world mission, one that happened in Edinburgh, Scotland, in 1910. There, under the theme Evangelization of the World in This Generation, the language of mission was to proclaim the gospel to the heathens. For that generation of Christians, to evangelize was also to spread Western civilization. Out of the 1,400 participants of that conference on mission, only 17 were not Europeans or North Americans. So to bring Christianity to the world was to say, we bring our way of life as Europeans, and that is what Christianity is all about. It is no wonder that Christianity does not always represent good news for those who are oppressed in the name of God. During the celebration of the 500 years of the conquest of America, a group of indigenous people sent this letter to then Pope John Paul II. And I quote, "We, the indigenous people of the Andes and of the American continent, take the opportunity of John Paul II's visit to give him back his Bible, because in 5 centuries it has given us no love, no peace, and no justice. Please take back your Bible and return it to our oppressors, because they need the Bible's ethical and moral teachings more than we do. Since the arrival of Columbus, by the use of power, one culture, one language, one religion, and a set of European values have been imposed onto us. During colonial times, the Christendom model set the theological agenda and preached the salvation of souls with a complete disregard for the well-being of the slaves, the poor, the indigenous, and the women. Nowadays, with the influx of tele-evangelism and its proselytizing mission, there is a new challenge called prosperity theology. The fastest growing religious group in Latin America is Neo-Pentecostalism, with its merit-making theology. Although it is less fatalistic than the pie-in-the-sky theology so typical in colonial times, the theology that preached that suffering in the present would entail rewards in the afterlife, prosperity theology operates with the same logic. In the everyday life, in the quotidian, God only blesses a few, that is, those who deserve to be blessed because they act according to God's will. This fundamentalist theology is very challenging for Lutherans and for Protestants in general, who affirm justification by grace through faith. It is also very individualistic because individuals are compensated with prosperity for their deeds, and those who do not attain that prosperity because they live on the streets, because they are poor, they're ill, they're hungry, they suffer from addiction, because they have to sell their bodies to feed their children, because they work as wage laborers in the large cash crop plantations. Those who are suffering are not met with compassion, but rather their suffering is explained away theologically by saying that God is punishing them or that God is trying them. You see how perverse this theology is? The motto of a particularly well-known self-proclaimed bishop called Edir Macedo is, "Stop suffering. Pare de sofrer. It is in your hands." It is as if one could actually pull oneself up by one's own bootstraps. And sometimes I've heard similar expressions also in the US, and maybe in our conversation you can correct me and clarify this to me. Expressions like, "God helps those who help themselves." This theology compensates those who already have privilege. To read biblical texts or statements on mission and evangelism as abstract maps leads to great dangers because the stories of the people themselves are not taken into consideration. Let's go back to the practice of encounter, of face-to-face interaction, and of listening to the gospel as it is told in the everyday life of people. Jesus was not silent about his mission to preach good news to the poor, to release the captives, and to give health to the ill. This mission was carried out not only in rhetoric, but in the quotidian, in the everyday life, in practice. It had implications for daily life. He visited towns and villages, seeing with his own eyes the conditions his compatriots lived in. He used a language that people could relate to because he used examples that came from the lives of common people, like he himself. The reign of God is compared to a grain of mustard or to the yeast that a woman uses to make bread. To enter this reign, we need to be like children, and we need to welcome children in our midst. Jesus talks about farmers, about vineyards, about oil lamps, about doors. He meets in kitchens, and he sits next to wells. The elements of everyday life are not just a matter of good communication skills, but because the message Jesus was talking about also related and had implications for daily life. Ultimately, Jesus was one among them, a real human being who could relate to the lives of others because he chose to live the fullness of human experience. He saw the poverty, the religious and economic oppression, and the mental and physical illnesses that afflicted the common people. Jesus saved souls, but he also fed bodies and healed lives. His mission was about hope, restoring the dignity of human life and the creation and the integrity of the entire creation. In the World Council of Churches mission statement titled Mission and Evangelism, Ecumenical Affirmation, that is from 1982, we read, "For all of us, the invitation is clear, to follow Jesus in identification and sharing with the weak, marginalized, and poor of the world, because in them we encounter him. Knowing from the gospel and from historical experience that to be rich is to risk forfeiting the kingdom, and knowing how close the links are in today's world between the abundance of some and the needs of others. Christians are challenged to follow him, surrendering all they are and have to the kingdom, to the struggle that commits us against all injustice, against all want." This commitment is very different from the prosperity theology I described earlier, or the type of mission that only aims for the salvation of the soul. This is the mission that also wants to save bodies, to heal lives, that takes discipleship seriously and wants to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. The model of mission here is not a ready-made map, but one that invites individuals and communities to be active participants in shaping their own reality and fostering networks of solidarity. The aim here is to heal lives and to address the human being as a whole. The ELCA, the Lutheran World Federation, and my own Lutheran church in Brazil have undergone major discussions on mission in the past decades. I have seen the concept of accompaniment, convivencia, or the role model of the disciples of Emmaus. And these concepts have helped us understand better that mission is not imposing the way of life of one group onto another, but to identify the signs of God's grace in our midst, in the quotidian, learning from one another, sharing our stories, breaking bread together, and together praying, working, and hoping. Furthermore, the focus is not the concern for the conversion of others to Christianity, but that of our own discipleship. The care for the least of my brothers and sisters is translated in actions of compassion, solidarity, and love. The hungry are given bread, the thirsty water, the naked clothed, the sick comforted, the strange welcomed, and the prison gates opened. In these everyday activities, the smallest seed is an anticipation of the reign of God. I see this happening in the mission work among those who are socially outcast, sex workers, drug users, homeless, HIV/AIDS patients, victims of domestic violence and abuse, unemployed people, those who are at the margin. This type of mission does not bring success or give us popularity. It is exactly the opposite of prosperity theology. It is, however, the work of Christian solidarity, what Martin Luther would call neighborly love. And in doing so, we can hopefully be as surprised as those who were listening to Jesus. Lord, when did we see you hungry and gave you food, and thirsty and gave you water? To whom Jesus replied, truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these, who are members of my family, you did it to me. Thank you so much. Should I? Okay.
Minutes for discussion, so please come in with your questions.
Here because I feel I miss you, you know? I long for closeness to other human beings here. Questions or comments or your own reflections on what you heard?
I'm 87 years old and 58 years in ministry, And unfortunately, I did not discover the power of the Order of St. Luke until late in my ministry. I'm now a member of the Order of St. Luke, and I'm wondering, in your travels and your reflections, have you thought about why the Lutheran Church has been so slow to have healing ministries more frequently than, and some don't have them at all?
Thank you for the question, also for your prophetic words, which means, on the one hand, gently critiquing, but then also showing that there is some hope. Thank you. One of the problems that I think we have in the Lutheran tradition, and why we are not as visible maybe in this type of mission that I was describing as the type of mission that makes me passionate about, is, and maybe I should not say this at a Lutheran seminary, has to do with the way we also educate people in our congregations. We follow very much an idea that if we have the best trained theologians, then we will have the best trained pastors, and then these pastors will be sent to congregations, and they will have then the best types of members. And the type of mission of the quotidian that I was proposing starts from another premise. It starts precisely by making sure that the people who are living their faith in their everyday life will find the resources, whether through their pastor, whether through the types of programs that are carried out in the congregation, through their neighborhood associations, and build from there on networks of solidarity. So you see this trickle-down theological education that we have does not always help us. It's outstanding, but we need to be thinking also in things that happen in a more horizontal manner. And that is what this presentation this morning was all about.
We read of agreements being made between countries and mission organizations to not carry out missionary work because it creates a lot of trouble, I guess you'd say. How do we deal with that concept?
The problem is that, and I can speak from my experience through the World Council of Churches and through the Lutheran World Federation, the people who are signing these types of agreements are the people who also have the type of mission, the vision about mission that I'm sharing, and hopefully the type of mission that is being taught in this institution, the type of mission that the ELCA supports, which means we do not take believers from other churches or from other religions as if almost like if we were fishing in their aquarium. It's kind of like, okay, that's easy. Let's just bring people because they already have that type of organization and a network. What is happening and what I am denouncing is the proliferation of the type of mission that is not even practiced by Pentecostal churches. In Latin America, we have, in several countries, we have very good ecumenical relationships with Pentecostal churches. I'm talking about a new development called Neo-Pentecostalism. And it is very much about profit. The church religion becomes a big business. And the type of prosperity theology, and the mission that they do brings the old, fire and brimstone theology. This is too outdated. Now people are enticed by this new way of success, prosperity. God will give me compensations here and now for the things that I do. The more I give to the church, the more God will give back to me. And these churches, they don't sign any ecumenical agreements because they are very anti-ecumenical. Sociologists of religion actually map out the creation of these churches, and the new churches are always they are created out of the descent from their mother church. So they are spreading out because there's a disagreement between the leadership, and then new churches are created. And that is regrettable because the people who have the sane approach, who would have a good contribution to give, we pretty much are a minority because these are the churches that are growing the fastest, I would say. There was a question over there? A comment?
Yeah. I did have a follow-up question about that. Do you have any sense of why they are growing as rapidly as they're growing?
Sorry,
The Neo-Pentecostalism and other movements like it around the world, do you have any sense of why they're so popular? I mean, they would seem in some senses to be indigenous.
well, they are so popular, and if you follow statistics, this is also happening in Africa. It's happening all over the world. I'm bringing the Brazilian, Latin American experience because that's the television I watch, okay? And it is so popular because it gives ready-made answers. Going back to the metaphor of the map, it is like a map quest, okay? You log on MapQuest, you say, I want to go from A to B, how do I do it? And it gives you this route, and usually the pastor of the congregation will say, you have to give donations to the church, you have to act according to what the list of things, the do's and the don'ts that come with the religion. Now, in doing that, it does have a certain measure of success. A person who would go for a job interview and would be completely, underdressed, would have very low self-esteem, would have no pose, somebody who would not have that necessary confidence. Now they are so pumped up by religion, they have, and this is the religion of the suit and ties, they go in and now they have that confidence. Odds are they might even get the job. Right? And then you see the effect it will actually have. You say, well, God has given this to me, and then in turn it will fuel more into the revenues to the church itself. So it is successful because, to a great extent, the Protestant and the Roman Catholic approaches have not dealt with the everydayness of life. And that is a big critique to our own theology. We need to go back and reread Luther and say, how did Luther relate to the everydayness of life? And of course, it wasn't in this fundamentalist perspective, but I think there is great wealth in our tradition and really to address some of the challenges that we are facing today.
One last question.
Can you give us some examples of, or an example of where this kind of quotidian mission is happening within the Protestant and Catholic churches that we would be have more affinity with?
In the Brazilian context in particular, this type of mission is happening to a great extent in the local congregations. And when I'm talking about mission, I'm not talking about, even though it is included, it has to do with the type of activities that are carried out in the church itself. In the congregation where my husband and I were serving, Sunday mornings, we would have between 100 and 120 people coming to worship. But throughout the week, we had 500 people coming to church for several other reasons. And that has to do with the everydayness. It had to do with support groups, with Alcoholics Anonymous. It had to do with dance. It had to do with youth and children and daycare. All of these things that you would say, well, but that is really not about saving souls, is it? But it has to do with carrying out and taking care, making sure that there was enough for activities for the people to do. And some of the best examples are the joint collaboration, ecumenical, with the church and non-for-profit, for instance, and some outstanding work being done all over the world. I mean, we could have, and that's one of the reasons I love the global mission events. Like, you can go and just see all of these tremendous initiatives. Work with prostitutes, for instance, and not just to go and say what you're doing is morally wrong and it's of ill fame, but what leads, what can we help to better the situation in terms of safety, healthcare, prevention of sexually transmitted diseases, for instance. Giving you one example, supporting small farmers who, in light of the large cash crop plantations that we have in Brazil, the church has taken as its mission to create programs to allow the small farmers to be on the land. And why would the church be involved in issues of creating a market for them to sell their products, or dealing with organic vis-a-vis, you know, the free trade? And all of that shows you how the church itself is involved in these activities, because it comes from an understanding that to talk about salvation does not refer only to the afterlife, but these are small signs. Whenever we can create networks of solidarity among the people themselves. And many of them are not even Lutherans, are not even Christians, and yet there's a sense we are doing our work, which is that of discipleship. It's not up to us to worry about issues of salvation. God saves. But we take care of those who are around us here and now. There was one last question over there. Would you?
Your request.
Yes.
I'm just wondering if this movement is age-related. Do we have more younger people who are going for the prosperity mentality, or what does that look like demographically?
The prosperity, or the type of people who are involved in this alternative, or going back to the roots, you know, of mission? I'm not sure I understood.
In the neo-Pentecostalism.
It has to do with a lot of young people who, in light of, if you are living in the global South, what are the chances of you to get a good job? Unemployment is rampant. I mean, the education you had will not prepare you. And then, of course, prosperity theology represents a good option for that. But it really cuts across age, because poverty hurts everybody. And in that sense, it becomes of high interest for people who don't have health care. A lot of the healing sessions and the exorcisms, and which happen also within the confines of prosperity theology of this neo-Pentecostal, afflict people of all ages. But those who are aging and do not have the type of care that they should have in those conditions. But what I find then interesting is the same can be seen also among those who are taking part in a mission more geared to the everydayness of life. You have very young people. You have people like Richard Wangen, who was in his 80s, retired and as active as anybody could be, and one of the people who founded this tremendous support group for people with HIV/AIDS, one of the, like, spearheading this whole movement in Brazil. And you can see it's there for everybody, and it's very similar to the conviction that Jesus himself was able to invoke on people. He was able to address the children, the women, the men, those who are ill, and I think that's also the urgency of our work today.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you guys.